It's yes or no. That's what Virginia voters will be asked to answer in a special election on this Tuesday, April 21st, where Virginians will determine whether to approve a proposed constitutional amendment that would give the state legislature the power to temporarily redraw congressional maps in order to balance out Congress. The new map stands to redraw the state's districts to give Democrats as large as a 10-1 advantage over Republicans. What does this mean for the Commonwealth? What does this mean for the country? And what does it mean for future elections moving forward? It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Eric Cavill, and you're joining us for our Get Out the Vote constitutional referendum here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. As always, I want to thank you for joining us, as you always do, as we broadcast from the campus of the Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nation, from none other than WNSB Hot 91, the soul of VA. You know, this is election season, and we just had Super Saturday, last Saturday, Saturday before last, early voting here in the Commonwealth. And listen, as I always say, and you know, as Virginia goes, so goes the rest of the country. Well, let me tell you, that holds true now more than any time ever. This referendum is getting a national view. When I say national, I mean it is going to determine, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but it's going to determine the balance of power in Congress. Now, but before we go into that, I want to make sure that you, the listeners, you, the citizens of this country, of the Commonwealth of Virginia, here in Hampton Roads and across the Commonwealth, are exercising your right to vote. This Tuesday, polls were open early in the morning, before 8 a.m. You can go in and vote up to 8 p.m. Go cast your vote if you have not already voted. Now, we know that this is a simple election as it relates to how you're going to vote, yes or no. And we're going to break down in this show why yes and why no, why the proponents and why the opponents believe that you should vote their way. And we're also going to look at the impact that this is having across the country. Now, when we take a look at what's going on, you know, how do we get here? You know, how do we get to this point where we're redrawing congressional lines mid-decade? Well, I'll tell you how. You've heard us cover this on shows throughout this past month. It's because of our president. Our president requested that the state of Texas give him 5 more congressional seats. That's right, 5 more. And why was that? Because how unpopular the policies of the White House are. When you look at what happened through Project 2025 and DOGE and cutting jobs and cutting funding, also when you take a look at the big beautiful bill that is called by, that it cuts $1.3 trillion, $300 billion from food, $1 trillion from healthcare, expanding Medicaid expansion. When you take a look at, you know, how the president is operating throughout hiring policies, eliminating various procedures and processes through his secretaries of various agencies, such as the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, and the list goes on and on and on. And then not to mention the international reputation now of our country and how our president handles world leaders in other countries. Many people believe that these are very unpopular and not good for the country. Now you have a lot that do believe that this is good for the country, or he's operating in a way that they approve. Whatever the case may be, the issue is if the Republicans keep the House of Congress, keep in mind all 435 seats are up for re-election, then that means that the Republicans will continue to allow our president to have unfettered control and be able to implement his policies without them pushing back on him. Now, keep in mind, Congress has abrogated their voice and also their power by not speaking up against the policies that their voters and the citizens of their state and district think that are not good. However, if the Democrats win the House, then that means you have one branch of government where their voice can now speak for the voice of the other Americans, the other half of Americans, if not more, that are saying this is not right. We need to slow down. We need to take a deep breath. and we need to reverse course on a lot of actions. That's what's at stake. So if you vote yes, that means that you're not happy with what's happening here in our country, and you're not happy with the Republicans and how they're representing the rest of the state. If you vote no, then that means you're happy. You're satisfied with how our president is operating, and you want 2 more years of what he's been able to do with this Republican Congress. That's what it boils down to. Very simple. Now, when we take a look at why it's been happening this way here in the Commonwealth, one interesting thing is that many people are saying, especially Republicans and those in Republican districts, this is not the Virginia way. Saying that we voted for a commission in 2020, 2021 to end gerrymandering. In other words, in the way that politicians draw their lines, right? Because draw lines for congressional and state offices were drawn by state legislators. And of course, their interests are a part of that. Well, the commission actually was voted on by citizens, and it was accepted as a constitutional referendum. It's part of the Constitution now of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then the commission was appointed, and the backstop is the Supreme Court of the state. Now, with that, this happens every 10 years. However, because of the president, mid-decade redrawing of lines have become okay. Keep in mind, before the president of the United States asking for this, Texas tried it in 2006, I believe. And the court ruled that this was not constitutional. You cannot redraw lines mid-decade. So you have to wait until the census, every 10 years it comes out. But the Supreme Court ruled that the Texas, in 2025, after the legislators redrew their lines and the governor signed off on it, and I'll come back to that point in just a moment, the Supreme Court said it was okay. And the congressional redistricting arms race was on. Now, let's take a look at what California did to combat this. The state of California saw what Texas did. So what they did, they redrew their congressional lines and districts to add 5 more Democratic-leaning districts. So by doing that, they put up a proposition to the voters, and the voters voted and they approved it. So therefore, balance is struck back in Congress. Now, why did they do 5? They could have did up to 6 or 7, but they did 5 because Texas did 5. In other words, the Democratic Party said, we're not wanting to take over control. We just want to balance out the actions and the policies of all. That's it. Not to change the way power is structured, but simply to balance it out. Now, after that, the president asked other Republican-led states. So therefore, Missouri answered. They redrew their lines and added 1 Republican-controlled leaning district. Ohio answered. They redrew and added 2 Republican-leaning districts. And then the state of North Carolina, they answered the call and redrew and added 1 Republican-leaning district. Now, in all of those states, the Congressional Black Caucus in Texas, Missouri, and also in North Carolina, the Congressional Black Caucus member district was pretty much eliminated. That means that this was a push against not just representation, but representation of those that have been pushing the arc of justice toward justice for all. And that is the Congressional Black Caucus. So when you say this election is not just about seats in Virginia, but it's also about equity across the board. That's what the proponents are saying. The opponents of those that are against it are saying, let other states deal with this. We have our system. This is not fair for us, so we're going to keep our lines like we are. 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans. But those that push back against that say that Republicans are not speaking up and speaking up for the state as a whole, and just simply asking the question of check and balance, which is what our democracy is about in the 3 branches of government, to stop the president and his agenda from moving forward that would harm or continue to do harm to Americans and Virginians abroad. Now, there's one other very unique aspect to what the Democrats did and what the Republicans did, both in California and in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The legislature put up a referendum or a proposition in California for the voters to vote on it. That's right. They are giving the people the chance for their voices to be heard. However, in Republican-led states that changed their lines, redrew their lines, the Texas, Missouri, Ohio, North Carolina, they did not ask the voters. The Republican-controlled legislatures in those states redrew the lines, and the Republican governor signed off on it, and there it is. Done deal. In other words, instead of letting the people have the voice, they operated very similar to how our president is operating, without checks and balances. So that's what's at stake. Now, keep in mind that this is a very new process because we've never seen this before because it was ruled unconstitutional. However, with this 6-3 conservative U.S. Supreme Court, they are turning back the clock and overturning decisions and going against precedents in order to give unfettered and unchecked power to states to pretty much do whatever they want, especially when it comes to civil rights and equity and equality for those who have been historically discriminated against, such as African Americans, women, and other people of color, and yes, immigrants as well. So this Tuesday, we will know, by the way, very quickly, we will know what Virginia say because of Missouri, Ohio, and North Carolina, there's a 4-seat imbalance now in Congress. That means mid-decade, Republicans have given themselves 4 more seats, 4 more leaning districts. So therefore, if Virginia follows if the voters vote and say Virginia should vote yes and balance things out, it would bring balance back to Congress. If that happens, then as projected, Democrats in the upcoming election will more than likely win the upcoming election and take the House of Representatives in Congress. Now, with that being the case, this is a big race. So therefore, everyone, or even on the national scale, are weighing in on this. Now, we're going to talk about the national in just a moment. Then we're going to delve into the Commonwealth and look at what this means for the Commonwealth itself. So, when we take a look at our Governor Abigail Spanberger, when she became freshly inaugurated, she, according to USA Today, she's backed the measure, which comes ahead of November midterms. Now, potentially paving the way for Democrats to gain as many as the 4 seats in Congress. Now, the election stands to potentially impact, again, the razor-thin margin in the majority in the House. Now, according to several political scientists, experts that were quoted here in USA Today, more specifically out of political science professor out of University of Mary Washington, James Madison University, and Virginia Tech, they find that this Virginia's high public mid-decade redistricting push has attracted support from the biggest rock star left in the Democratic Party now, and that's former President Barack Obama. So he's come in, and you've seen the commercials across the board, and he's pushing across the board, vote yes. However, we've seen a mixed messaging across the board as well. So with that, they're saying that this is a opportunity or a moment in order to bring balance back to Congress, and it's only temporary. That's another word that you have to pay attention to. And according to the professor of politics and public policy at University of Virginia, Jennifer Lawless, she said even if Virginia chooses yes, the state will return to its independent map-making process after the 2030 census, which state law requires a 16-person bipartisan commission to draw maps every 10 years. So here, when you take a look at what's happening, it's just an attempt to allow voters not just to give it a shot, but also to approve a temporary measure only. But there are voters who might be reluctant, or voters who may think gerrymandering is unfair and being asked to consider it in the short run, according to President Lawless, as a temporary fix to district lines that are perceived as already unfair. So when we talk about what this is about, some say it's about gerrymandering, others say it's about restoring fairness. But one thing is true, as Virginia goes, so goes the rest of the country. It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Eric LaVille, and you're joining us for our Get Out the Vote show for the 2026 constitutional referendum for redistricting. That's right. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we will find that this Tuesday, we will know whether the Commonwealth of Virginia will bring balance back to Congress for a temporary measure that the people will vote on in order to bring balance back to the 4-seat advantage that the Republicans gave themselves by other Republican states at the behest of our president, asking them to redraw their lines in order to add more Republican districts. Now, there are many that have seen that this is unfair. Therefore, the Democratic-controlled legislature here, the General Assembly, said that we're going to step up to the plate and challenge this. So, according to USA Today, the question becomes, is this restoring fairness or is it politically risky? So when you take a look at the fairness, that's what it's about, making sure that voters across the country, well, first of all, making sure that there's balance in Congress, but then also making sure the voters have a voice in the process itself. Those that oppose it say that this is not the Virginia way. Allow other states to handle this. We've got our own process. However, those that push back against that say that the Republicans are themselves speaking up against the president, which they're not, then they would not be trying to redraw these lines mid-district. But whatever the case may be, we find that there is a major political push on both sides. The money that's pouring into this race is out of this world. We're finding that when you look at the money, we've got over $40 million. The Democrats, of course, have a fundraising advantage when you look at this particular effort. And when you look at the money that's pouring in and the messages on the Republican side or the opponent side, you're finding mixed messaging where individuals are seeing confusion, especially when you talk about African-American voters who are the most faithful voters of the Democratic Party. Now, one area that you're finding, one advertisement you're finding that is confusing voters is the fact that there is a map for, they believe, that are going to eliminate the voices or minorities. I don't like to say minorities. I'll say a majority, non-white, as it said, majority minority districts, right? So when you look at the maps, in one effort, some of the population of majority minority districts are drawn out and placed in the new district to make it more Democratic leaning. So therefore, you have the opponents that are against the redrawing are saying that the black vote is going to be eliminated. And we've come too far as African Americans or black people to have our voices eliminated. Well, according to the maps, of course, this is misleading because they're not being eliminated. The two districts that are headed now by African Americans, Congressman Bobby Scott, who is the dean of the federal delegation. He's been in Congress over 30 years. In District 3, Congressional District 3, which encompasses most of Hampton Roads, when you look at Newport News, Hampton, and Norfolk, it is still majority minority. When you look at Congressional District 4, which the base of that, or the seat is Richmond, and then it encompasses, of course, Petersburg as well, it is still majority minority. It's headed up by the first African-American woman to become a U.S. Congresswoman, and that is Jennifer McClellan. Now, of course, that seat was held by Congressman Don McEachin, who passed away, and also a great brother of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. So those districts will continue to be African-American or majority minority. However, some of that district was drawn out in order to provide some Democratic leaning support to Republican districts that were primarily next door. Does that mean it is muting the voices of African Americans? No. However, you find that as when you look at the No campaign, they're jumping on it and they're using it. Also, you find where individuals are confused because they see one message of President Barack Obama on television saying, vote yes. Governor Spanberger saying, vote yes. However, targeted advertisement where you look in mailboxes of African Americans and Democratic voters, it shows former President Barack Obama and the governor saying vote no. Gerrymandering is wrong. So you have confusion in that way. But whatever the case may be, the message is itself sizing up. And what do we mean by that? Early voting is an indication of that. According to WTOP News, early voting has picked up in Northern Virginia ahead of redistricting referendum. As a matter of fact, when you look at before Super Saturdays, you saw that Republican turnout was tremendous. It was overwhelming in early voting. However, when you look at what is taking place in this particular election, this special election, which normally has a much smaller turnout, you find where experts say that appears to have boosted early voting numbers in Northern Virginia. And these are majority Democratic-leaning districts. Roughly 40,000 votes were cast on Saturday, last Saturday, on Super Saturday in Northern Virginia. Counties, according to the data collected by the Virginia Public Access Project, also known as VPAP. Now, they find that, according to Karen Holt, a professor at Virginia Tech, she says it's really difficult in places like Fairfax County, for example, to actually physically get to the county registrar's office in order to cast a ballot. Therefore, in Fairfax County alone, 17,000 ballots were cast at early voting locations on what's called Super Saturday, right? With just one question, we find, yes or no, this amendment is very important. So, with that being the case, we found a recent poll, the Washington Post Schar School poll, found a narrow support for the measure from voters who had already cast their ballots or plan to vote. So, when you take a look at this referendum, if passed, the regional map could shift enough seats to cancel out Republican gains from redistricting in other states and secure Democrats a majority in the U.S. House. Now, according to WTOP News, this turnout is on track to meet Virginia's 2025 general election turnout. Now, think about that. The general election for 2025 was for the governor, right? That and the president is the biggest election years in 24, the even year, and then right after the even year, the odd year, which we elect our governor, is the biggest election in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this special election, one vote, yes or no, you got two bubbles. I've already early voted. And it's two bubbles, yes or no, and you choose the one you want. It shows that more people are going, or just as many people that voted for the governor are going to vote in this special election. That is not surprising, especially when you look at the Republicans that stand to lose their representation. So therefore, it's expected. So with this, it's picking up. It is tracking. And according to experts who spoke with WTOP, they believe that more voters have turned their attention to the referendum as the special day election approaches. I mean, you can't help but to, right? Look at all of the advertisement that you're getting, and everything that we're seeing. As a matter of fact, according to a good friend of mine, Karine Charles Dungo, the campaign manager for Virginians for Fair Elections, she said, they're excited to see the energy that was on the ground on past Super Saturday. She said they had a chance to canvass all kickoff events throughout the Commonwealth. Great turnout. People are turning in, the whole nine. Now, on the other side, this is not lost in them either. Republicans are gaining momentum. Former Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin pointed to recent polling that showed a drop in Democratic Abigail Spanberger's approval rating as evidence of Virginia's dissatisfaction. However, Youngkin says Spanberger spoke out against redistricting while campaigning on the campaign trail, but has since urged Virginians to support the amendment. Now, of course, Republicans or opponents of it are jumping on this message as well. But again, Democrats and those who are for this amendment are saying we're only doing this to counter what the other Republican states have done. That's it. It's temporary. So with that, when you look at what is taking place, when you look at the impact that this is having, Virginia has the opportunity to level the playing field. Keep in mind, this is just not a simple state election. It is an election for the balance of power in Congress nationally. As Virginia goes, so goes the rest of the country. Another area that we're looking at when you talk about this election, and going into the final stretch, the Hill publication, they talked about and discussed, how heavyweight donors have poured millions into this contest. I mentioned it earlier. when you take a look at the amount of money that's pouring in, it's still going to be a close race. According to Democratic strategist Jared Leopold, he said, it is a unique special election where both Republicans and Democrats are pretty motivated. And they're motivated because, Democrats could gain seats and they could also keep those seats in the 2030 redistricting. Who knows? And Republicans could lose seats. So therefore, everybody's engaged because the balance of power is sitting in the balance. And we'll know by 8:05, something like that, on Tuesday. 8:05, 8:10, 8:30, 9 o'clock, 11. We'll know by 11, definitely. And with that, we'll find out where Virginia stands. Now, this doesn't mean, just because they're Democratic leaning, doesn't mean that they're going to be all the way Democratic. That doesn't mean the Democrats are going to win it, but it means it's leaning that way. I've always said that, especially after we take a look at what has taken place with the White House and the unpopular policies, especially the impact on Hampton Roads, veterans, our military, just to name a few. Virginia's a purple state, and there are even areas that are more leaning one way or the other that could flip because of how Virginians are. When you take a look at Congressional District 2 with Jen Kiggins and former Congresswoman Elaine Loria, she's running against Congresswoman Jen Kiggins for that seat. When you take a look at that particular district with a heavy military influence and how that district has flipped more times in the last decade than any other district in the United States, the Democrats could win that without redistricting. So it's a purple state. In other words, just because these districts may become Democratic leaning doesn't mean that a Democrat will win them, but it's highly likely that they will. So when you move forward and take a look at what's taking place, ultimately, it is all about your voice and your voice being heard. You, the voters, have the opportunity to really push the narrative, to make sure that your voice is heard. When you talk about heavy hitters coming in, you can look at House Speaker Mike Johnson, who campaigned last weekend with several Virginia Republicans whose seats would be sharply redrawn if a referendum succeeds, according to CNN Politics. Also, Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries rallied supporters last weekend in Charlottesville, Richmond. And again, this is a true sign of a heavyweight fight. And again, the Commonwealth, not just the Commonwealth, but the balance of Congress hanging in the balance. So when you look at nearly 63,000 early in-person votes that were cast across the board just in one day, this is, again, much higher than last fall Democratic sweep of all three offices. That means that you got a lot of Republicans that are voting. And again, you should expect that. So when you look at this year's vote, according to CNN Politics, turnout in Northern Virginia was about 46% higher than the equivalent date last year in 2025. 57% higher, roughly, of the state have cast. Statewide vote was cast in the region, up from 41% last year. That was a gubernatorial year. Ultimately, the decision is going to be made, and the decision is going to be made only if you vote. So make sure your voice is heard. And I want you to also tune in to our local CBS affiliate, WTKR, where I will be fortunate enough to provide feedback of the vote coming in and out starting at 5 o'clock all the way up to the 11 o'clock nightly news. So once again, I want to thank you for joining us on State of Water, where we bring movers, shakers, and information to you so that you can make a more well-informed decision. Cast your vote matters. Until next time, be good, be great, God bless, and we'll see you next week.
Hi, I'm Carrie Washington, and you're listening to State of the Water with award-winning host Dr. Eric Claville.